The Game's alcoholism is getting serious. The Game just stood on the Verzuz stage against YG, grabbed a full bottle of Don Julio Reposado, and drank almost the entire thing in one continuous gulp. Clips of it are everywhere right now, and the reaction underneath them isn't. That's a wild flex. It's genuine concern from people who have watched this man for 20 years. But before I get into exactly what happened on that stage and why it's blowing up the way it is, there's a bigger question underneath all of it. Where did the Game's alcoholism really start? Jayceon Taylor built his entire career on being larger than life. He came up under Dr. Dre in the early 2000s, got placed in 50 Cent's G Unit to build his commercial profile, and broke out huge with his 2005 debut The Documentary, a triple platinum album that put West Coast rap back on the map at a time when the coast had gone quiet. From there, he kept going. Doctor's Advocate, the R.E.D. album, LAX, a string of #1 and top 10 projects that most rappers 20 years into a career simply do not still put up. He's still releasing music right now in 2026, still touring, still one of the most recognizable West Coast names alive. Along the way, he became just as famous for the chaos around him as the music itself. The G-Unit fallout and the beef with 50 Cent that followed became one of the most talked about rivalries in hip-hop history, dragging on for over a decade, spilling out across diss tracks, radio freestyles, and constant social media shots, before the two finally called it off with a public truce in 2016 that both men later admitted had kept their names relevant through the years in between. He's had public back and forths with Meek Mill, with a 10-minute Eminem diss track that dropped in 2022, with a long list of other names, to the point that music outlets have literally written entire standalone retrospectives, just cataloging his beefs like a career timeline of their own. He's the guy who will jump on a freestyle and drop 10 names in a single verse, the guy who never backs down from a camera or a controversy, the guy whose Instagram has been a source of headlines almost as often as his music has for the better part of 2 decades now. And the drinking has always been folded into that same persona. Not hidden, not something he's ever tried to downplay, practically a signature move at this point. Game has downed liquor on stage before, more than once, and for years it read exactly the way he wanted it to read, as showmanship. A grown man having fun, hyping up a crowd, playing the role of the rowdiest, most unpredictable guy in the building. Nobody clutched their pearls over it back then. That's actually the whole reason this latest one hits different, because the pattern underneath the stunt has been sitting in plain sight for a long time. And this is the moment where people finally started connecting the dots out loud instead of laughing it off. Go back through the footage and you'll find Game doing versions of this exact bit before, more than once. At an MTV concert in Nairobi years back, he downed 2 full 750 milliliter bottles of what looked like vodka on stage in front of thousands of fans, finished both of them, and then kept rapping for another half hour straight, like it barely touched him. At the time, it played purely as a stunt. Reporters covering it weren't even sure if what he was drinking was really alcohol or just a bit for the crowd, and Game leaned into that ambiguity instead of ever clearing it up. The show went on, the crowd ate it up, and it became one more wild story in a career full of them. Then there's the effing vodka incident, one of the stranger footnotes buried in his long list of beefs. One night, Game got visibly drunk, drinking 50 Cent's own liquor brand of all things, and hopped on Instagram to fire off a rant using the hashtag #GetReal while clearly under the influence. It became one of those moments hip-hop media treated as a punchline, filed under "that's just Game being Game," rather than something anybody actually sat with as a potential warning sign. Nobody in his camp addressed it as a concern. It just got absorbed into the ongoing chaos of his online presence and moved on from within a news cycle or two. Individually, none of these moments were ever treated as a big deal. And to be fair, a rapper drinking on stage is not exactly breaking news in this industry. Plenty of artists do it. Game in particular has always turned his performances into a full circus, regardless of alcohol, bringing out surprise guests, going on long tangents between songs, talking almost as much as he raps. But stack these moments next to each other: the 2 vodka bottles in Nairobi, the drunk effing vodka rant, and now, most recently, a nearly full bottle of tequila, chugged live on one of the biggest stages of the year. Line them up and it stops looking like a recurring bit and starts looking like a habit that's gotten harder and harder to look away from every time it resurfaces. This particular Verzuz didn't happen in a vacuum either. Just months earlier, back in April of this year, Game posted that he'd been shot at while driving his truck, firing off an angry, profanity-laced message aimed at whoever was responsible before quietly deleting the post not long after. He never gave a location, never gave a timeline, and never clarified whether he personally returned fire or whether it was his security detail that responded in the moment. Fans spent days searching for answers that never really came, and to this day, the incident remains only partially explained, with Game himself the only source for what happened. Whether or not that shooting connects directly to what happened on the Verzuz stage months later, and there's no confirmed link between the two, it's fair to say the months leading into Compton Forever were already a turbulent stretch for him publicly. More incidents, more headlines that had nothing to do with music, more moments where fans were left checking in on his safety and his state of mind rather than just anticipating his next verse. And that turbulence sits right next to a completely completely different story he's been trying to tell about himself at the same time. In late 2025, he put out the final chapter, West Side Story, which he announced as his definitive retirement album, the kind of project an artist drops when they're trying to close a chapter with some dignity and control the narrative on their own terms. Then in April of this year, the same month as the shooting incident, he opened the Taylor Heritage Center in Compton, a multi-use facility built to give local youth access to recording studios and boxing gyms. He's leaned hard into the elder statesman role over the past year, showing up on shows like Drink Champs as the guy with the encyclopedic knowledge of hip-hop history, mentoring the next wave of West Coast talent instead of competing with them. That's the version of game he's been actively building in public this year: the reformed elder, the community builder, the retirement album veteran with nothing left to prove. So when people tuned into Verzuz expecting a celebratory victory lap through one of the deepest catalogs in West Coast rap history, and instead watched him grab a bottle and drink like he had something to prove to himself as much as to the crowd, it didn't just read as a fun bit, it read as a contradiction of the exact image he'd spent the better part of a year trying to put forward. And that contradiction is a big part of why this particular clip traveled as far and as fast as it did. To understand the size of the stage this happened on, it helps to know what Verzuz actually is at this point. The format started back in 2020 as a pandemic era. Instagram live creation from Swizz Beatz and Timbaland, two producers stuck at home like everyone else who figured artists could just go head to head playing their biggest records off a laptop. It blew up immediately, turning into must-watch television during lockdown, and after a run of legendary matchups, it eventually went quiet for a stretch before Complex relaunched it in October of 2025 as a full live in-person showcase, 2 10-song rounds, real crowds, real production. Since the relaunch, it's already hosted Cash Money Records against No Limit Records, French Montana against Rick Ross, and B2K against Pretty Ricky. A West Coast legacy matchup between Game and YG was exactly the kind of marquee booking the reborn format needed. 2 Compton names, 2 different eras, 1 shared hometown. The matchup was billed as Compton Forever. Game against YG, 2 generations of the same city stepping into the same room to go bar for bar and hit for hit. YG, born Keenan Daquan Ray Jackson, and 36 years old at the time of the battle, represents the generation right after Games, the guy who linked up with producer DJ Mustard back in 2008 to found the label Pooh Has Inc. and broke through with records like Toot It and Boot It before growing into one of the West Coast's most reliable hitmakers over the years that followed. At 46, 10 years older, Game came up in an entirely different pipeline, built directly through Dr. Dre and Aftermath. 2 different eras of the same city, 2 different paths to get in there, both still active and both still selling out rooms 2 decades and change into their careers. It was already a heavy night before either man said a word into the mic. To understand just how loaded this night already was before Game ever touched a bottle, you have to go back to December 2021 at a festival called Once Upon a Time in LA at Bank of California Stadium. A stacked lineup that included Snoop Dogg, Ice Cube, 50 Cent, Game himself, and YG. Backstage that night, a rapper named Drakeo the Ruler, real name Daryl Caldwell, was jumped by a group reported to be somewhere between 40 and 60 people and stabbed in the neck. He died from his injuries. His mother later said YG had appeared in the backstage area right before the crowd rushed Drakeo, and that YG's crew and Drakeo's crew had clashed just before the stabbing happened. YG has always denied any involvement and has never been named a suspect, but the beef between him and Drakeo was well known in LA rap circles, and the shadow of that night has followed him for years since, including onto a track on his most recent album, The Gentleman's Club, where he directly addresses the rumors and denies having anything to do with it. That investigation is still active nearly 5 years later, and it's what brought California Highway Patrol and a Burbank SWAT team to a commercial property connected to YG at around 7 a.m. on the very morning of Compton Forever. Video from the scene showed YG standing outside the location while officers carried out the search. He was detained, questioned, and released without charges within hours, but it wasn't his first brush with Burbank law enforcement either. Back in October 2024, he'd been arrested there on a misdemeanor DUI after police found him outside his car, which had gone up over a curb. None of that is directly tied to what happened later that night on the Verzuz stage, but it's worth knowing going in, because both headliners walked into Compton Forever, already carrying their own separate weight. YG had spent his morning being questioned by police in an active homicide investigation. Game had spent the months before it dealing with an unexplained shooting of his own. Neither man addressed any of it publicly until YG brought it up himself once he got on stage that night, telling the crowd plainly that he'd almost didn't make it to this stage at all. Game opened his set by bringing out Blink-182 drummer Travis Barker for a surprise live drum breakdown on his LAX cut Dope Boys. and the crowd lost their minds immediately. Earlier that same day, the two rappers had linked up to drop a brand new joint record called Red People, produced by Verzuz co-founders Swizz Beatz and Timbaland. Both artists repping Compton and their blood affiliations over a hard, bass-heavy beat built specifically for the occasion. On paper, before a single bottle got involved, this was shaping up to be one of the biggest and most celebratory West Coast nights of the entire year. Then the drinking started, and it never really stopped for the rest of the night. Throughout the battle, Game kept taking pulls from a bottle of Don Julio Reposado between rounds, visibly working through it, song after song. At one point, in front of the full crowd and the live stream audience, he grabbed the bottle, tilted his head all the way back, and drank almost the entire remaining contents in one uninterrupted gulp. When he finally finished, he dropped the empty bottle to the stage floor and celebrated like he just landed a knockout blow in the battle itself, not like he just poured most of a bottle of tequila down his throat in a single continuous motion in front of thousands of people. From there, viewers started noticing the shift in his performance almost immediately. To his credit, Game still brought real energy for stretches of the night, and he had genuinely emotional, sincere moments mixed in with the chaos. He reflected on his early encounters with Nipsey Hussle, telling stories about their history that hit the crowd hard given everything that's happened since. He also gave YG his flowers directly and publicly, telling him, in his own words, that he'd had the cheat code coming up with Dr. Dre and Eminem in his corner from the jump, while YG built his entire lane from the ground up with no stamp of approval from anybody handed to him. He turned one of his own most memed freestyle openers into a genuine tribute in that moment, and fans online praised it as one of the most sincere things Game has said in a Verzuz setting in years. But the drinking kept catching up with him as the rounds went on. Fans and outlets covering the event described him as visibly intoxicated for large stretches of the battle, his energy sliding from sharp and commanding early on to noticeably looser and less controlled as the night wore into a second half. His catalog carried him through certain individual rounds regardless, with West Side Story narrowly edging out YG's My End, and The Voting and Dreams beating out Gangbang in a close call. But the overall consensus by the end of the night wasn't close at all. YG took the fan vote decisively, 19 rounds to 3, with the single tightest moment of the entire battle, landing on a dead even 50-50 tie between Hate It or Love It and Still Brazy. Even fans who walked in rooting for Game admitted afterward that his song selection and his stage presence simply couldn't keep pace with YG's run of mustard-produced anthems once the tequila had really taken hold. Here's what actually separates this moment from every other bottle Game has ever grabbed on a stage over the years. In Nairobi, in the F and Vodka rant, even earlier in his career, the drinking always felt attached to a self-contained moment, a stunt with a clear beginning and a clear end that the news cycle moved past within days. This time it happened on a stage built specifically to celebrate his catalog and his legacy, standing next to a hometown peer, broadcast to a modern audience that has grown a lot more comfortable calling out concerning behavior in real time instead of just laughing along with it the way people did a decade ago. The clips from Compton Forever didn't just circulate as a wild highlight reel moment. They circulated with captions from fans openly asking whether somebody in his circle needs to step in and have a real conversation with him. Put that next to a year that already included an unexplained, still murky shooting incident that he addressed publicly for about a day before deleting the evidence of it himself. And it's not hard to see why a viral clip of the Game chugging a bottle turned into a much bigger conversation about what's actually going on with him beneath the surface, rather than just another funny Verzuz moment to add to the pile. Nobody close to him has addressed any of this directly as of this video, and Game himself hasn't offered any explanation for the moment beyond letting the clip speak entirely for itself in the days since. The split in reaction actually started before the bottle ever came out. Heading into the broadcast, advanced voting on Complex site had the whole thing nearly even, 51% favoring YG to 49% for Game, and fans were already picking sides hard in the comments. One fan wrote that Game had it in the bag by a landslide out of pure respect for the catalog, saying it wasn't even fair. Someone in YG's corner fired back just as hard, pointing out that YG's pool party and club era records meant you had to have actually been there to understand the impact, and that this was a genuinely big deal for his side of the fan base. That back and forth was already setting the tone before either artist grabbed a mic. Once the bottle moment hit though, the tone of the conversation shifted fast. Clips of Game tilting his head back and draining the Don Julio started circulating within minutes, cut and reposted across every hip-hop page and clip account that covers these events. And where a similar clip from the Nairobi show or the F and Vodka rant might have gotten treated as comedy a decade ago, this time the top comments underneath almost every repost leaned concerned rather than hype. People pointed out the timing next to the April shooting incident. People brought up his age, 46, and the fact that this isn't a 25-year-old still finding his footing. This is a 2-decade veteran who's been in the game long enough that a moment like this reads as pattern rather than isolated incident. The tone wasn't outrage, it was closer to worry, which for an artist whose whole brand has been built on being unbothered and unshakable unbreakable might be the more uncomfortable reaction to sit with. For now, Game walks away from Compton forever, having lost the fan vote to YG in a fairly lopsided decision, 19 rounds to 3, in a night that was supposed to be a celebration of 2 generations of the same city. In a post-event interview, Game did confirm one concrete piece of business to come out of the night, telling Complex that YG is officially featured on his long-awaited album, The Documentary 3, calling it, in his words, some Westside Bumpton shit, and noting that it's been 22 years since the original documentary put him on the map. So professionally, at least, the night ended on forward motion. But the bigger story coming out of that night was never really about who won the battle, or even what comes next musically. It's a single, viral bottle chug that's pushed a lot of longtime fans to look back at a pattern they used to write off as pure personality and start asking harder, more serious questions about what's actually driving it this time around. It's worth saying plainly that nothing here is a diagnosis. Nobody outside Game's inner circle actually knows what's going on with him day to day, and drawing a hard medical conclusion off one viral clip, no matter how many old clips you stack next to it, will be getting ahead of what anyone can actually confirm. What is fair to say is that the pattern is no longer easy to laugh off the way it used to be. A stunt in Nairobi years ago is one thing, a drunk rant on Instagram is one thing, but a nearly full bottle of tequila chugged live on a stage built to celebrate 2 decades of his own legacy, months after an unexplained shooting he still hasn't fully addressed. In the same year he opened a youth center in his hometown and dropped what he called his final album, is a lot of contradictory signals happening at once for anyone who's actually been paying attention. Whether this becomes an actual turning point for him, whether somebody close to him finally addresses it directly instead of letting the clip speak for itself, or whether it just gets absorbed into the churn of the news cycle the way the Nairobi bottles and the effing vodka rant eventually were, is something only time, and maybe Game himself, is going to answer. What's different this time is that the audience watching isn't letting it go quite as easily. And if you stuck until the end, you'll probably also want to see these videos on your screen next. Have a good one.